Hello, I'm Des Dearlove, co-founder of Thinkers50. I'd like to welcome you to Thinkers50 at Hult, a collaboration between Thinkers50 and Hult International Business School. Our mission at Thinkers50 is to be the world's most reliable resource for identifying, ranking and sharing the leading management and business ideas of our age, ideas that we believe can make a positive difference in the world. Over the next few weeks, we are showcasing some of the world-class business thinkers among the Hult faculty. We want to make these sessions as interactive as possible, so please do let us know in the chat where you're joining from today and send over your questions at any time during the session. Our guest today is Dr. Amanda Nimon-Peters. Amanda is Professor of Leadership at Hult International Business School. She started university at age 16 and holds a first-class honours degree in psychology from the University of Adelaide and a PhD in behavioural science from the University of Cambridge. Amanda's work addresses leadership challenges by combining a deep scientific understanding with her lengthy senior management experience as a team leader at Procter & Gamble in Europe, a board director for a UK housing charity, a successful startup founder in Dubai, the dean of a business school, and it goes on and on. And once upon a time, even the science team leader at a field camp on the Antarctic Peninsula. She's the author of Working with Influence, 9 Principles of Persuasion to Accelerate Your Career. Amanda, welcome.
Hi, lovely to meet you, Des.
Yeah, no, it's really good to have you here. Can you tell us before, I want to talk about the book, and I want to talk, I think the whole topic of how we influence people is just absolutely fascinating and, kind of a perennial topic. But can you tell us a little bit about your journey, if you like, what influenced your kind of career trajectory?
Well, first of all, I'm aware of the research in this area that says it's very difficult for us to predict what's going to make us happy in terms of career choice in the long term. So I've never kind of planned where I would be in 10, 15, 20 years. I've only ever tried to make a good decision for the coming 3-4 years at a time. And every time I've made a decision, I've tried to look at what is kind of going to help me grow the most, challenge the most, learn new things, what's going to be fun, exciting, put me with people that I want to work with. But the very first stage in my career, as you mentioned, was working on the Antarctic Peninsula, and it was a behavioral science challenge because my special remit, I was working with the Scott Polar Research Institute at Cambridge University, and I was looking at the extent to which breeding penguins in Antarctica are influenced by the different behaviors of tourists. And that was a really special and unique challenge because when you work with penguins, of course, you can't actually ask them what they think. You can't ask for their opinions. And so you have to actually just track what they do and what factors affect them. And then that has gone on to have that underlying discipline of looking at what is the evidence for what drives our behavior really has been the underlying expertise that I've brought through each of those jobs. So you talked about a bunch of different jobs, but when you're working with Procter & Gamble and you're looking at what should we do that will influence people en masse to move from, let's say, Sunsilk to Pantene, again, you can ask people what they think, but when you run behavioral science analysis and experimentation, what you do is you look at large-scale data analysis to understand what drives changes en masse. And so that has been my particular area of interest, whether I'm dealing with penguins or people buying shampoo or my own startup, or what's going to drive satisfaction amongst students at a business school. In all of these cases, it's this behavioral science foundation.
Okay, and observing penguins, how does that relate to your work at Hult? I mean, do you see other parallels with working with people in the classroom?
I guess the key thing is simply that when you're dealing with humans, they do have opinions on why they do the things they do. And those opinions are valuable and an interesting source of information, but they're not always correct. And so when I'm working with humans, I also have to bring in this additional factor, which is what people think has an influence on them versus what science shows us is true. So it makes it a more tricky balancing act, let's say, than working with penguins, where you don't have to take into account their opinions.
Yeah, no, I think that's fascinating. A very good answer. Let's talk a little bit about the book, Working with Influence. It's published by Bloomsbury Business last year. What inspired, I mean, the book's a lot of work, but what inspired you to write the book, and why is this topic so relevant right now at this moment in history?
Well, I think the key thing was essentially that I needed a textbook that was suitable for what are very international cohorts of postgraduate business school students that I work with. In a classroom where I have 50 people, I might have 30 different nationalities. So I have people really from all around the world. And these are MBAs, executive MBAs. They're mid to senior in their career. They're entrusted with positions of leadership. And what I found is that the approaches that were available for helping them develop their influence and persuasion skills just really weren't suitable for 21st century professionals who were seeking greater influence over outcomes at work. So the models that existed, and you will know of some of them, you will have heard of some of them. For example, Robert Cialdini's Principles of Persuasion is probably the most famous model being used by people. But across the models that were available, what I found is that they had sort of three typical characteristics in common. And the first of those was that fundamentally, a lot of the way that people approach influence is based on selling. And I wanted to get away from selling. Certainly the approach of, getting people to say yes to something, buy something, do the thing you're asking them to do, there's a place and there's value to that. But for most 21st century working professionals, we will gain more from thinking in terms of long-term influence, social capital, how to have greater success over the course of this month, this year, this career, rather than just winning today. And when you win, when you sell somebody something, and you take this very short-term perspective, what you won't be aware of is that winning today can actually cause a decrease in your influence in the future. So as I say, first thing was I wanted to get away from this idea of selling. I wanted to get into a model that was more about building social capital and long-term influence. I said there were three factors. So first is based on selling. But the other two factors of models like Robert Cialdini or let's say Dale Carnegie, both of which have a lot of value in them, but they are 20th century models. And as a result of being 20th century models, there's also sort of no getting away from it. They're very US-centric models. And the roots of a model like that don't take into account decades of research in disciplines that didn't even really exist in the 20th century, like neuroscience, for example, nor indeed the many very good studies that we now have coming out of places like Africa, like Asia, like the Middle East. And there are the volume of research that has been created, for example, in the 40 years since Cialdini published his model is enormous. And so my approach really was, okay, let's just start again. We'll build on the basis of all of this research and wide-ranging, cross-discipline, international literature review, and let's look through that to distill what are the factors that drive human decisions and human behaviors, specifically relevant to 21st century workplaces. So that's really where my focus was.
I mean, for probably one of the first ever sort of business blockbusters was Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. So there was a long, as you say, there was a very long history to this particular topic. But do you have to, I mean, I take your point about the new research we have. Do you think that human beings are fundamentally, we may know more about them, but is the way we assert influence and use influence and understand influence, has it actually changed, or is it simply that we have new lenses to examine it through? Are we fundamentally the same creatures that we used to be?
We've been fundamentally the same creatures for about 300,000 years. We think that we've changed, we've evolved, but the humans have not evolved so greatly. So our model, the actual design of a human being hasn't changed so greatly. What has changed since, and Dale Carnegie, fantastic book, it's just written in 1930s, right?
Yeah.
What has changed, it's not so much humans, the model, the design, right? And I'm talking about the design as a species globally. What has changed is how much we know about it. So Carnegie's book was written basically on the basis of his advice, and it's good advice, but it's advice. Cialdini's work now in the 1980s is based on research from the 70s and 80s in North America. It's very valuable. It has a lot to it. But ultimately, as I say, since 1984, I mean, we've been able to measure what's happening in people's brains when these things are going on, right? So what has changed is that we just have an enormous volume of data. And that was the reason that I said, okay, let's start from the beginning. The other thing that's changed, not the human model, but is the workplace in which we operate. So if you go back to 1980s North America, you're in a used car yard, you know, you might be able to get away with selling somebody kind of a dodgy used car that didn't work, right? But in your workplace today, where you're interconnected with people across the world, and people will tend to come back, they cycle back into your life, right? And customers cycle back, and old bosses and contacts, and you don't want to burn bridges. And so this, as I say, this approach is different because the context has changed. We need a model that isn't based on selling, that's based on long-term building of relationships, on building social capital, and that isn't forceful or unethical, but that just simply taps into the way that human brains work. And as I say, we know a lot more about how human brains work today than we did in the 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned how globally connected we are. I can see that we've got people joining us from Dubai, where you are, from Paris, from Romania, from Spain, from Copenhagen, from New York City, and from Beirut. So, you know, just illustrating the point that the audience, the people we're talking to today, are a global bunch. Tell me a little bit more about how behavioral science, you know, what sort of new light that shines on this topic, because that's obviously that's very much a discipline that's come through in the last few years. How, and obviously something that's dear to you. How does that inform, you know, your writing and your work?
Oh gosh, thank you for that question, because I love talking about this topic. Okay, so just for listeners, so that they can get some good technical understanding, behavioral science is basically, it's an umbrella term for all science-based disciplines that take the scientific approach, that to use systematic, objective data to identify the variables that en masse change human behavior. So when you're applying behavioral science as an approach, you're not necessarily going to be able to get the outcome you're after every single time with every single person. It's not about that. Understanding what changes human behavior en masse most of the time for the most people is about taking a more strategic long-term view than the sort of short-termist me with this one person. And what behavioral science enables us to do then is to understand trends that we are not capable of observing as individuals. Now, specifically, if we look at behavioral science within the field of influence, this is where it can help us enormously. And the reason is that we're really not as good at influence as we think we are. And you mentioned that, you know, there's people joining us from Beirut, there's people joining us from all around the world. And whoever you are and wherever you are joining us from, there'll be some of you that are thinking, oh yeah, but I'm pretty good at this. I can get people to trust me. You know, I'm good at like building relationships with people. But I'm here to tell you that behavioral science shows us that en masse, the techniques we use, they're really not as good as we think they are. Just as a small example, you know, studies that ask people to look at different messages and choose which one will be most influential tend to choose the messages that actually have almost no effect when they're rolled out en masse, just based on somebody's opinion. But there's more to it than that. And there's more to the fact that our approaches to influencing others at work are not as effective as we think. And that's because most people's influencing strategies are default techniques. Default means they don't need to be taught to you. They're just things that you do naturally, you've learned through your own experience. And as a result, I can tell you that makes them highly predictable. So let me give you an illustration. When we look at meta-analyses, and what that means is analysis of studies from around the world, we might take 50 studies that are published everywhere from China to, let's say, South America. And we do analysis. We look at how do people go about influencing another person at work. And what we know is that there are really sort of four main approaches somebody would use. The first is rational persuasion, which is, please do this for me. Here are all the very good reasons why you should do this. The second technique is a kind of exchange or bargaining, which is, I'd like you to do this for me, and in exchange, I will help you, or do this for me. In exchange, I'll buy your coffee, or it's some kind of exchange. If you do this, I will give you this. The third technique is typically a type of compromise between what you want and what I want. And then the fourth technique, which is also predictable, is if none of these work, then we go to the sort of pleading and begging, which is, oh, please, please, I'm going to get fired if you don't do this, right? Now, I'm not saying that those techniques don't work. What I'm saying is we don't need to teach them to anybody. These are your absolute default techniques. And even with a group of people from around the world, if I give them a simulation in which I ask people to attempt to influence others, these are the go-to things people do, guaranteed. What I want you to notice about these techniques is that they have some very common elements. And the first is that your influence attempt is absolutely noticeable, right? It's very clear to the other person that you're attempting to influence them. And so what that essentially means is whether you're using rational persuasion, here are the good reasons, or please, I'm going to get fired, or the exchange bargaining, which is, please do this for me, I'll give you something, it's very obvious to the other person that you're trying to influence them. And you are essentially asking for a favor, which means you're essentially borrowing from your social capital. So they might be effective, but once we take this long-term approach, and incidentally, they're not as effective as you think they are. In fact, we know that rational persuasion, although it's the single most frequently used technique in the workplace, it only has about a 12% relationship with getting to the outcome you're after, unless the person you're speaking to directly reports to you. So it's not as effective as you think it is. But more importantly, when it does work, you're borrowing from your relationship. And what I wanted to do through this approach of behavioral science was instead understand how human brains work, and then provide an approach where you don't have to lie, you don't have to be unethical, you don't have to make anything up. You simply take your message or what it is that you want to do, the idea that, or the outcome you're after, and you package it up in a way that it just makes sense to how the person's brain already works. And as I say, as a species globally, we really have so much in common about the way our brains work that this kind of approach can be effective around the world. You're not telling somebody something that's untrue. You're simply translating how you want to influence them into an approach that fits with how their brain is already working. And as a result, you become more effective in getting to the outcome you're after.
I'm going to have to ask you for an example. I mean, I hear what you're saying, but what does that sort of look like if we were going to try and make it a bit more grounded, make it a bit more concrete for people?
Okay, so let me think about that. Okay, so let me say, and this is an area where there is a lot of research, because one of the most common things, scenarios at work is when, in terms of influence at work rather, is if I'm going to ask you for help, okay? So, and it's a typical example that I'll often use where I'll put people into a situation and say to them, okay, what I want you to do is play this role where you are going to influence another person to help you in some way. And as I say, there's a lot of behavioral science research by people like Vanessa Bowens, for example, at Columbia University, on what happens when we ask other people for help. Now, in scenarios where somebody goes to ask another person for help, what we find is that they'll typically use one of these 4 approaches, right? Rational persuasion, exchange bargaining, compromise pleading. Please help me. I'll give you this. Please help me. I'm really desperate. But in actual fact, if we understand factors that are most likely to drive that person's behavior, what we can do is, instead of asking for a favor, we can change our request into something that they would actually want to do. So let me give you an example or name one of these principles. There's a principle in the 9-principle model called reasoning. And I chose the name reasoning because attempting to reason with somebody is the most common thing we do. What we often do is we give somebody a lot of good, logical, rational reasons. Please do this because the boss needs it, the company does it, needs it, the market is changing, customers are demanding more. But here's the thing, nobody really cares about all that stuff at a deep emotional level. That doesn't light up the reward center of anybody's brain, right? If instead you were to say to me, please, would you change this app that you're using or this process that you're using? It's going to save you 45 minutes every single day. That's a really good reason for me to start doing it. But when you get the email from the IT section of your company that says, by the way, that system you're using, we're going to delete it. We're going to add in this new system because we have to be SAP compliant and we have to be Sarbanes-Oxley and we have to do this and the market's changing and blah, blah, blah. What you're doing is you're asking somebody to do something. You're giving them a whole bunch of reasons which in your head make logical sense, but the other person doesn't actually care about it. So they perceive what you're asking them to do is like a pain or a nuisance. You're taking away something I was using. You're going to replace it with a new system I've got to learn. But in actual fact, if your IT department sent a note saying, by the way, the system you're using, we're going to take away, we're going to replace it with something that it will make your life easier. Yes, it will take 20 minutes to learn it. But after that, you're going to save all of this time. They don't need to write a 3-page email on all the reasons you should do it. Now it's become something that you want to do. And this is a situation where you haven't lied, you haven't changed anything. You're not telling people if you don't do this, you won't have access to your emails. You're not forcing it on anyone. You're changing an outcome that you want to make happen from something you're asking people to do or explaining to them why they should do into something that they actually just want to do. And that's the principle of reasoning. It's principle number 6 in the model.
Okay, that's good. I mean, basically, you're kind of aligning their best interests and your interests, and finding where the common territory is or the common ground is. A little bit. Let me say, if you were to do that, you'd almost fall into that compromise bucket, right? Which is, this will be good for you and it will be good for me. Just in brackets, just beside the, let me whisper to you, people don't care what's good for you. They only care what's good for them at a deep psychological level. So just focus on what's good for them. Okay, that's good. Just looking at some of the comments coming, Olga says, I highly recommend reading the book. One of the best reads I've had in a long time. Thank you, Professor. So that's good. So that is the cue for us to dig a little deeper into the book. You mentioned one of the 9 principles. I'm not sure how much, whether we're going to get through all 9, but perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about the principles and about some of the other principles.
Oh, you don't need to know all 9. I mean, you don't need to remember all 9. I had to make a choice about how far I would go in the literature. And I wanted to cover the things that I feel will help you with these 9 principles. You're probably covering about 75 to 80% of the variability in outcomes, if I can say that. That's my estimate. I don't have systematic data to back that up, but that's my estimate. I'm looking for the big drivers of what affects people's decisions. And these are all very valuable, very strong patterns in human behavior. So you don't need to try to apply all 9. That would be a very difficult task for you to do, is to keep 9 things in your head and try to apply them all at once. There are 9 so that I can cover the main drivers, and I've put them into a 3-by-3 model to make them easier to remember. But realistically, at the end of the day, you only need to choose one. And I'll give you an example. Principle 5, which is called effort, is about the fact it's a huge driver in our behavior as a species globally, irrespective of country, background, culture. Humans are programmed to take whatever is the path of least effort to get to the minimally acceptable outcome for the thing that they want. So if you ask me to predict what are people most likely to do in a situation, the answer to that is whatever is easiest, unless they really care about something. So 99% of the time, unless it matters to me to run this marathon or to really work hard, most of the time, most situations, what my brain is doing is choosing, how do I get there as easy as possible? Minimum seconds spent thinking, minimum words to read, okay? That in itself is just one principle. So if you want to make it if you want to make it likely that people will do something, the number one way to do that is just make it as easy as possible for them to do that. You don't have to explain to them. You don't have to pay them for it. You don't have to dangle a carrot. You want somebody to do something. If I ask you simply, I hold out a button and I say, please, Des, will you press this button? The effort involved in that is so little that most people won't even need a reason why they should do that. And conversely, if I want to make it unlikely people will do something, I can just ensure there's a lot of effort involved, and absolutely guaranteed the number of people trying to do it will drop from whatever mega number down to hardly anybody. That is a force of human behavior, and guaranteed in your influencing attempts today, you're not using it. So this model is not a model where you need to remember all 9. It's not complex. Brains don't work like that. You can't apply 9 different parameters at once. Choose one. But just so that you have an awareness, it's a 3x3 model. There are 3 principles which are related to the people around you. That's the principle of status, the principle of social norming, and the principle of affiliation, who you feel is on your tribe. All of those are considerations that you could apply regarding who are the people you're interacting with. And these social factors dramatically affect people's behavior and decisions far, far, far more than anybody realizes. Then we have 3 principles which are related to how people perceive the world around them. Principle 4, which helps us to see the fact that we're very poor at evaluating anything without comparing it to other things. And so when you know that someone is going to take a value and immediately look for something to compare it to make it big or small or fast or slow, when you know people will do that, well, you should be providing those comparisons. That's how the brain works. It immediately looks for a way to evaluate any object, idea, price, path of action, anything. So that's principle 4, framing, value framing. Principle 5 is effort, and 6 is reasoning that we've talked about. Then the final 3 principles are all related to your own behavior and the ways in which your behavior can actually sabotage the influencing attempt that you're trying to make. So those are all factors that are under your control. And so simply, my advice is, we know there's 3x3 principles, but you don't need to remember or try to apply all 9. Simply take a flick through, pick the one that appeals to you most, and work on adding that into your toolkit. And you will see a dramatic improvement in your ability to influence outcomes as you progress in your capability at applying that principle.
Fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. I have to say, it's a really interesting subject. But a lot of people who are, particularly people in senior management, they're probably thinking, well, yeah, okay, but I don't need to use those levers because I've got this thing that's called authority, and I've got this thing called respect, and to some extent, the old hierarchical. Basically, I don't need to influence people because I can just tell people what to do. What are they gaining by familiarizing themselves with your principles and with this way of operating?
So I think there are 2 key disadvantages that senior managers suffer from. And the first is that there is an extent to which in the workplace, if the people around me report to me, then yes, they are more likely to do the things I say than if they don't report to me, right? But that's not a skill. So if you exist in an environment for a period of time where you don't have to have any skill, what happens to your skill? Right? It drops. And so you can end up finding that somebody who's been in a position where they're used to have just having the people around them do the things they say, end up being actually not very good at influence, because position is not a skill, it's just a factor. The other key thing is that so my recommendation is, let's put it this way, unless you're actively working on improving your skill, we know that there's good evidence your skill isn't improving. Yeah. The other key area where I think senior management has something to gain is simply that, ironically, we tend to miss out on excellence when we are experiencing moderate success rather than failure. And let me just give you a little insight into that. So failure is obvious. If you do something and you fail, it becomes very clear, okay, that was bad. And then you have a choice. You can either run away and never try to do it again, or you can work on it, right? But if you're going about your days and everything's ticking along and you're kind of going okay, you not only never have the impetus to try to improve, you often can't even see that there's more you could improve. And so my recommendation is mostly senior management or mid to senior management, let's say, that I work with. And my recommendation is always, irrespective of what level you're at, you can sharpen your skill a lot more than where it is today.
No, that's good. And it's great to see we've been joined by some old friends. It's nice to see Joan Bigham here and Bogdanovich as well. People who have been following Thinkers50 for a number of years, and it's great that they're tuning in today. Is it possible to learn to influence people if you're introverted, or certain? I mean, I think we tend to think that the Dale Carnegie book always seemed to be written for kind of extroverts rather than introverts. But can anyone learn some of these skills?
100%, and that is fully science-based. We have a kind of narrative and a kind of, in a sense, mythology about skill and about talent. And it's species-wide. So as a species, and when I say as a species, I mean humans globally. I don't mean versus gorillas or something, but I mean humans globally, right? We show a measurable preference for stories about people who are just like natural talents and overnight superstars. And when we have a story about somebody who became successful because they worked really hard, which is frankly almost everybody who's been really successful, we don't want to read that if there's a story that says, oh no, this person was just born that way, right? We like the mythology around natural inheritance. But what science shows us, and this is where behavioral science can add so much more to our understanding, is that while there is natural variability between people in skill levels, so if you're naturally introverted, you may not have done as much interaction, or you may have different approaches which are not as effective. And yes, indeed, there are inherent natural variation between people in skill levels. But what we know from science is that when a person puts in systematic effort aimed at improving day in, day out, practicing and working deliberately on building that skill level, the degree of variability that is induced between people, or that is induced, let me say, the degree of variability that is induced based on that hard effort and systematic approach vastly exceeds the degree of variability that we get just from natural variation. We just don't like hearing that story. And so I want to tell anybody who's introverted, who's listening to us, just like anybody who's shy, just like anybody who's never been any good at mathematics, just like anybody who's thinking, oh, would I be able to do that complex skill? The science says 100% you can. And that's, by the way, irrespective of your background. It's simply about being able to focus on your incremental, systematic improvement. Little bit by little bit by little bit is the way people build expertise, and you can do it in any area in which you are willing to work.
So basically, if you work those influence muscles, they will get stronger.
Yeah. Absolutely. It might take longer to get to the level of someone else, but if you keep working, nobody can predict how great you can be.
Tortoise and hare sometimes, sometimes the tortoise starts slower, moves slower, but gets there. I'm going to take a couple of questions because we've got some great questions coming in. I mean, this one, just going to lob it at you and see what happens. But Kia, asking it's the sort of question that you probably had before, but it's still fascinating. How is influence being affected by generative AI?
By what? Sorry,
generative AI. ChatGPT and all this AI stuff that we're hearing about, artificial intelligence stuff we're hearing about. Is that going? Because I think some of the concerns around generative AI is that these algorithms, people are we're already having our buttons pushed in all sorts of ways as human beings, and these machine learning techniques are going to get very good, and obviously there are ethical concerns, but that's one of the I think one of the big areas is around influence. Yeah.
So what we've seen, what we've seen in the world of work is, of course, a great deal of enormous change, rapid change, which creates a lot of stress around people, rapid change in the form of all kinds of things over the last couple of decades, and not only AI and all of the potential stress and issues that brings. But what we also have at the same time is a rapidly changing world of work, which creates a lot of stress for people, is a social environment now, which is also probably more divisive than it's ever been. And this is partly driven not only by social media, but and the echo chambers that creates, but also the huge echo chambers created by AI, by the fact that in a bid for algorithms to sell and put in front of you things that you might want to buy, you're also getting put in front of you, the news stories that are most likely to make you click, right? Everything about us, our environments where we see news, where we interact with people, the images that we see are being engineered to create the environment that artificial intelligence thinks will appeal to us. Okay, so this ends up making us, as I say, a more divided society than with more concerns about who I am, who other people are, segmenting people into these very tiny clusters. And that divisive environment is not an easy one for us to sustain. I think one of the reassuring things about this particular approach to influence is that because what I've been looking at is what are major trends in humans across the world. And as I said to you earlier in this interview, that the human model itself, the way the brain works, has been basically the same for a very long time. When you understand what is the same about us, there's a sort of reassurance to it. I mean, in the same way, people often ask me about like cultural differences. Oh, how does all this play out in India versus China, let's say? And again, my response to that is that when we look, we see differences. But actually, when you measure what is the same about us is a much bigger component of our behavior than we're aware of. So in the same way that AI creates, as I say, more stress, more divisiveness, and we become aware, we're dealing with people from all over the world who look so different from us. As I say, there is a kind of simplicity and reassurance to the fact that as humans, there is so much about us that is the same. And it's an approach like this which enables you to get back to, well, what does drive the human brain? And again, those things are very reassuring. When people feel that you are part of their tribe, when you're on their team, when you're concerned about their interests, they're more likely to behave favorably towards you. And what this tells us is that we should be putting more emphasis on building bridges and links and relationships with people. I don't mean toxic positivity or false compliments, I mean really looking for the things that are the same about us and cooperating. That's where we can really grow our influence. But as I say, that is that approach, which science shows us would work better on humans generally, is in the face of social media, which wants to get us angry. And I act as if it has an emotion, but the goal of these algorithms is to incite our ire and our concern, so that we will interact, so that that application can gain more, right? Gain more attention, get more what's it called, seconds on screen for a particular product. And so I hope that approaches the question, that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, to take the other side of that equation too, I mean you kind of mentioned or alluded to earlier that we people often think they know what influences them. I mean, because another way to protect ourselves from these undue influences is to have a better understanding of what our own buttons are. But do you find that people do have a good understanding, or actually are they deceiving themselves with their understanding of what pushes their buttons and what influences them?
I don't know that this will be a popular answer, but we're really not
We're not going for popularity. We're only going for insights.
I could be very explicit on this one. We're really not very good at knowing what drives our behavior. And we can see that in neuroscience. When you make a decision, you'll often think that you made that decision for rational, logical reasons, right? Why did you buy that car? Why did you take that job? Why did you decide to date that person and not that? And you can give all kinds of explanations, and you'll even believe them. But actually, we're, for example, far more driven at a subconscious and emotional level than we would ever expect we are. And we can see it when we look at patterns, larger patterns of people's behavior. It's just that it's not visible to the individual. So we know, for example, in the workplace, our behavior is far more driven by how we feel about the other people at work than we are able to recognize, than anybody will even believe. But we can see it in experiments. So people's understanding of why they do the things they do, everybody has a story. And this is where humans are very different from penguins. Penguins, I don't have to convince them. But with humans, everybody thinks they know what influences them or why they do the things they do. But really, most of the time, our conscious experience is lying to us. It's true for me as much as anybody.
Yeah. So we talked about learning, trying to use these muscles better. How can we harness some of the things you've been talking about to, because I mean, I think the point that's being made, I've lost track, Elizabeth is making, is that, easy versus care deeply. When you come to something like, climate change, clearly long term, we do need to do something about this, but it's easy to not do anything about it. So how do we tilt that balance? How can we make people care more?
And so, Elizabeth, I think sorry, I can't see the question, but if your question is easy versus care deeply, easy, right? If your goal is to influence the behavior of 7.5 billion people, it will be far easier for you. Well, not easier. You will be far more successful if you can make what you want them to do as easy as humanly possible, then there's a very good chance you will see the people take that route, okay? If what your goal is to do is to first make people care deeply and then get them to change their behavior, that's a very difficult thing to do. And it's a less sure pathway to getting to the outcome you're after. What we can see in behavioral science is that when you make something easier to do, any pathway to a given outcome easier to do, then there's a huge impact on human behavior, provided that that pathway goes somewhere they want to end up. So let's have an example. Let's say you want to change the way that transport happens in your city. You want to get people to stop driving their cars and instead use other methods. You could go the route of getting them to care deeply and then hope that that deep care leads to a change in behavior, or you could just simply set up the city so that I say just simply, it's not simple at all, right? But I'm speaking in a hypothetical world in which we have the chance to change these things. If my goal was to have people use public transport, the best thing I could do was just simply make it incredibly easy for people to do that. And you'll find that people's behavior will change. You don't have to make them care. You just have to make it easy for them to do. And that's one of the biggest problems with climate change, is that people care a great deal, but it's not easy. People don't know what behaviors to take. They don't they don't know how to change their behavior. And even if they do, there aren't alternatives. And so instead, what happens is you see all this pent up frustration where people protest. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't. I think if I were 19, I'd probably be a member of Extinction Rebellion too, right? But at the at the end of the day, you can make people care, but how can they change their behavior? The alternative approach is just changing the behavior, just make the behavior as easy as possible, guarantee people will change. How do we get to that outcome? Gosh, I wish I had a solution to that. I wish I could tell governments, just do it like this and everybody will change their behavior. But my money would be on easy versus care deeply.
Amanda, it's been a fascinating conversation. We are out of time. I knew this would happen. We just start to really engage with it. It sounds as though there's some really useful lessons and messages, not just for senior management, but for policymakers and politicians and all of us really in your work. So where can people go? Obviously buy the book, get hold of the book, but where else can people go to keep track of your research and your work? Yeah.
The book probably best ordering on Amazon as the easiest thing to do. And to find me, LinkedIn, if you type in Amanda Peters, you'll probably see about 100,000 people. If you type in Amanda Nimon-Peters, there's only one. So it'll be me.
Amanda,
I'm happy to answer your questions.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in and for all your fantastic questions. Our guest next week will be Mark Esposito, Professor of Strategy and Economics at Hult, an internationally recognized expert on the fourth industrial revolution. So same place, same time, please join us then. And thanks again, Amanda.
Oh, you're welcome.